morning, all of you, and thank you really so much for investing your time with us welcome to this panel. So far, I think it's the only panel who's tackling environmental topics and digital impact, the environmental impact of the digital technologies. So I'm Tere Badia from Culture Action Europe. It's the network of networks here based in Brussels. And okay, first of all, I want to thank the CPDP for hosting this discussion. It's a difficult discussion, but it's a necessary discussion in the framework of the conference. Thank you very much to Angar, who's organizing this panel. Angar is the Center of Production and Research of Visual Art that is based in Barcelona. And very special thanks to Joana Moll, because he brought us together to hold this discussion. And she's the one who created this constellation of contributors, and I do hope it will bring us other insights around the topic, which are indicated in the title of our session. I have to say that this is an honor for Culture Action Europe to be moderating this panel today. As I told you, this is the only panel tackling these topics, and from the cultural perspective, I think, and as well from the responsibility of the ones who are creating a lot of content that is being consumed right now in internet. So I think it's a topic that we have to address and as well under this perspective. So the title of the panel is Data Economy, AI Privacy and Sustainability in a Context of Climate Emergency. In more concrete terms, we will tackle the data that we do have to evaluate the materiality and environmental impact of technology, which is often embraced by metaphors as light as the cloud, as the virtual, as the digital, so it looks like they don't have a real weight, but they do. We seek to understand the extent to which older modes of relations, such as extractivism, have morphed in the digital age within the paradigm settled by the digital economy, also called capitalism of platforms. The panelists will give us diverse analysis of how the hard infrastructure, servers, data centers, cables, raw materials, and the soft infrastructure, algorithms and interfaces operates in this economy. And we will discuss also how society in its broad spectrum, but how as well companies and public bodies can efficiently tackle the critical environmental of our current data ecosystem and try to imagine together future sustainable technologies. We will approach these topics from diverse perspectives. At the panel, we have an artist, we have an activist, we have a policymaker, and we have a generalist. And all of them have been researching on this topic since a while. Joana Moll, she's an artist and researcher, studies topics like surveillance and social control and the precarious balance between politics, economics, data, technology, humans, and nature. Yaser, Hammadi, has a public policy master. He is a researcher with Minesipder, a blockchain protocol for responsible sourcing of materials. Fieke, near me. It's a researcher and practitioner on issues related to technology, autonomy, power, and human rights. And now she is a PhD candidate at the Data Justice Lab, where she's researching the impact of data-driven policy practices on European societies. And Alexandra Lutz, who is a legal expert and environmental activist and is working actually as a policy advisor for a French Green MEP, member of the Parliament, the European Parliament, David Corman at the European Parliament. So let's start with Joana. Joana, since 2014, you have been constantly researching the hidden environmental impact of the current data economy. Your project, CEO Tugel, the forest, the hidden life of Amazon user, all of them tackle these topics. Please, could you introduce us the results of the research regarding both the materiality of the internet and the environmental costs of AI?
I will try. Yeah. Tere, thanks for the wonderful presentations. Thanks everybody for being here, also to you. I know it's the last day and everybody's really exhausted, so we'll try to make it as light as possible, because it's a hard topic, as Tere pointed out. So my speciality, let's say, of my research in the last year is to reveal all this hidden materiality of basically a data economy, right? Which is massive. And just to understand the data economy is already a lot of work, yeah, without its environmental impact. So even though like our digital economy is expansive and it has a lot of actors, we only really relate to it through interfaces, yeah, like just interfaces. The internet is the biggest thing that humanity has ever built, probably, right? But it's really, really invisible. And again, we just access physical and intangible interfaces. Yeah, this is a picture of the first interface that was ever created, graphic user interface, in 1963. It's called Sketchpad. And from then, we just went on and on. Yeah, we are just attached to this, as Tere said, no? It is a narrative of the cloud. Which, what is the cloud? Yeah, the cloud is being sold as something ethereal, something that doesn't weigh, something that doesn't pollute. It's white, it's celestial, and it's up. And this couldn't be just as far as reality, because the internet is down. It's underground, it's dirty, it's messy, and it's highly, highly polluting. Yeah, this is some undersea cables that are landing in New York City, coming from the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, that's how our data is being transported, and that's the hubs where this is happening. There's also people inside the internet, and when you see all this amount of infrastructure, you see, how can this possibly work? Yeah, but it works. But then you can also relate to the materiality when you see this, yeah, and the pollution and the heavy amount of energy that's needed to produce all the data, keep it, and manage it. This is, yeah, well, that's a little bit old, but it doesn't change much. It's a map of the current undersea cable infrastructure, which is quite massive. I mean, to go into detail into this map, we need like a whole workshop, maybe 2-3 hours. We don't have the time. But there is great resources in the internet if somebody is interested of interactive undersea maps and so on. So, like 2 years ago, I found this research. It was published by a Dutch researcher, and she stated that for the first time, devices were the most polluting industry in the world. Yeah, just before the meat industry, housing, transportation, coffee, and aviation industry. And then you wonder, okay, but why is that, right? Because at the end, okay, I can understand that devices have a lot of impact, yeah? But data has also, it's something that we tend to neglect. That was in 2010, maybe. I can't remember exactly, but iPhone disclosed like how they were producing their iPhones, and they disclosed that the iPhones had more than 10,000 different pieces that came from more than 700 different territories, were assembled by more than 300 pairs of hands, and that's a lot. And there is also like a very big actor in all this digital economy that we tend to forget, and it's the shipping industry. With the shipping industry, what basically facilitates it's that the world becomes a global factory, yeah, and that's how we can build such sophisticated devices as well. Yeah, 700 different territories. All these materials are mostly being transported by ships. There is also a lot of materials needed to produce these devices. Well, Yaser is going to talk extensively about that. Some of them being more critical are rare earth minerals. Producing all these devices, it's highly, highly polluting. This is a work that was on unknown fields. It's a British artist group, the artist researchers. So they went to a refinery facility in China where all the radioactive waste was falling into a lake next to the factory, and it was all toxic waste. Yeah. So here they've mapped like how much toxic waste was derived from a single production of a battery of a car, the big one, the medium one, a laptop, and the small one, a smartphone. I saw them live in an exhibition in Berlin. The big one is something like that. Yeah, so it's not something small, it's quite big. And this is just for the production of one device, yeah, one thing. So again, this is the hardest part, yeah, how much our data pollutes. And this is very controversial, and please, if you tweet this, say it's an estimation, yeah? Because it's very, very hard to estimate the amount of emissions that transferring data makes. Because, as I said, internet is so big, and there's so many actors in a single transfer, in a single query. Yeah? So it's impossible to map, first, the energy consumption, second, the real emissions. This number, I took it from research in Berkeley, in the university, that I did in 2008 on the environmental impact of online advertising. Yeah, since then, there's been a lot of other research, but everybody points out different numbers, and it always depends in a very particular network with very particular conditions. Yeah? So, but it's good to have a number to start with. Yeah? Something that everybody stated is that if this transmission of data is being carried down through 3 and 4G networks, this is 4 to 5 times bigger, the impact, yeah, for the sort of technology used in it. As I said, I'm an artist, as Tere said, and I was very worried about visualizing those issues, yeah, because how such an obvious link, it's not embedded in the social imagination, and not even now. I think we're much more aware, but when I started to do this in 2013, 14, like nobody really talked about this, and you said this to somebody, it's like, yeah, data pollutes, and then everybody says like, oh, of course it does, but I never thought about it, right? So I did this project, which called, I can't even pronounce it, CO2 Google, yeah? So it tries to understand the amount of emissions that global queries to google.com generate per second. I opened this just when we started to prepare the panel. But then I thought, okay, but we always talk with numbers, right? And numbers sort of make us understand a lot of things, but it's very hard to relate to those issues or to quantify them in a way that it can affect us, or it can really define what it really means for us as living beings and for humans and non-humans. So then I did this. It was like another attempt. So this should be like the amount of trees, and it's an average. And it's a speculation, yeah, in a very high degree, of trees needed to observe the emissions of the real-time visits to google.com per second. Yeah, I came up with a number, estimation here, estimation there, and the end everything is a big estimation, but 23 trees per second. So for me, it wasn't so important to come up with a very precise number. Yeah, as I said, for me it was really critical to make this link between data, pollutes, and that's it. Yeah, and there is other actors affected, and it's happening. It's estimated that the amount of resources that ICT will consume by 2025, it's going to be, I think, 2/3 or 20% of the global electricity, which is really not little. Yeah, it's quite a lot. So we can say that devices can actually act as competitors for human resources, for human and non-human resources that we need to exist. Anyway, this is like another example of to visualize such issues. So this is the amount of coal. It's from an artist, German artist called Michael Saub. He did this in 2009. It's the amount of coal needed to burn to serve 1 million views of the trailer of Avatar. Yeah, this movie by James Cameron with all these blue people, yeah, wandering around. So that's it, and it was a lot actually. It was emitting 54 tons of CO2. And again, this is something critical. So on average, a user will produce now with 3G, 4G networks 2 gigabytes per month on average. This is a global average. But with 5G networks, the number will increase up to 30 gigabytes a month. Yeah, and we all talk about efficiency, right? And yeah, it's going to be more efficient, and it's going to allow much more data to be produced. Yeah, but it's going to also increment like the pollution, even though its efficiency is going to be better. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. But just to put some numbers, the number of devices connected to the networks in 2020, it's estimated that by the end, it's going to be 3 times the global population, if not more. And again, it would take more than 5 million years to watch the amount of video that will cross the internet every month this year. Yeah, and it's a lot. I mean, actually, streaming out for around 80% of the online traffic, and it's really, really highly polluting because it's a lot of data. So this, when it comes to ad tech, it's also quite a polluting industry. That's a map that Cracked Labs did, Wolfie Crystal, in collaboration with, I don't remember her name, but you can find it in the internet. So they tried to make sense of all the ad tech map. And you can see that there is like a massive number of actors involved as well. I did this research in 2008 that also Fieke helped me quite a lot on the dating industry. And I could determine that for one single user, there were more than 700 different companies connected to that user when he was operating and sucking data. And this was just from desktop activity. Yeah? And all these processes that run beyond the interface and are in charge of collecting, managing data, doing psychometric profiles, training AI, whatsoever, we don't know, we don't have access to them, but they're very, very polluting. Because you need a lot of energy to produce, manage, keep data at large. Then it's when I did this project, this I published it just 2-3 months ago, that this really talks about more like the environmental impact of ad tech and so on. So I went to Amazon and I just did a very easy purchase, the easiest purchase I could make with the minimum steps necessary. So Amazon forced me to go to 12 interfaces, I couldn't do less, yeah? And I bought a book. But then I also mapped all the code underneath of that we're constructing or activating through these 12 interfaces. It was more than 80 megabytes of code, and it accounted for almost 9,000 pages of printed code, which is massive. And you don't expect that, and it's something that you don't see. If you're a little bit geeky, you can try to find out. That's what I did. So this project just talks about this amount of megabytes that's being loaded. It's all the code that was being loaded behind the first interface. It takes you like 3 minutes to get to the second interface. And when you quantify it like that, you know, and you involve human labor in it, like really loading all this code, you really understand those things. Yeah. So anyway, the whole, if you want to scroll down to the whole piece, it's about 15 minutes average, more or less, of code and interfaces. And this was like the minimum required steps. Yeah, so imagine when we just wander around and we click here and some preference here and, well, this looks good, let's see what else. It's massive. And the most critical part of this, I think it's like part of the energy needed to develop all these processes fall on the user. Yeah, because everything, all these things are loaded in your computer that is plugged in the electricity in your home. Yeah? And this is very important to understand it. And it's something that we have no control whatsoever on it, but we are being forced into it. Yeah? So I want to talk about this, how much time I have today?
Like 2 minutes.
2 minutes. So this Chapin's paradox, because I think it's something, it's quite critical and it's quite important now and urgent. It's this paradox that it says, right, that of course when technological progress increases the efficiency, yeah, which means basically using less resources, yeah, basically to save resources, to save energy. But what happens when we do this, and this politics of efficiency, it's that then the demand increases exponentially. And something that it was intended to be efficient, I mean, it is efficient, but the demand grows so much, it's not efficient anymore. Yeah? And I think that's how we approach this problem, especially when it comes to digital and data, right? Just make everything more efficient, so everything is going to be more sustainable, but this means that basically we're going to use it more. Like if we just think about how much data we were producing just 5-6 years ago when smartphones weren't so successful, and the amount of data that we produce now per day, there is a massive jump, yeah? So anyway, I think just want to finish with the data centers that, well, I think everybody here might be very familiar with it, but they have a huge environmental toll, especially also not just energy, but when it comes to occupy amounts of lands, like the new data center, like large-scale data center that is going to be built in Dublin. It's going to occupy the same amount of square meters as 24 football or soccer pitches. Yeah, and that's quite a lot. That's a lot of land. Same, I mean, Microsoft had this great idea of putting data centers underwater as an experiment, just to use renewable energies to cool them down, which means the sea. Yeah, but without really talking about what would this mean for the undersea ecosystems. Yeah. And I'm going to finish with this. So this is like Amazon. This was a tweet that was posted in March 2019, where all of these big companies that are already, like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, also some Chinese companies, data companies, they are already working intensively with fossil fuel companies in order to make them dig better, more efficient, fast, and more. Yeah, and this motto is like fuel the future. I think it's good to close my intervention. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Joana. It's always impressive to see the real material, the real matters of the internet. So we're going to jump now to policy level. Alexandra, Lutz, so you focus as policy advisor in this intersection between digital technologies and ecological transition. How is the actual European policy framework tackling sustainable data economy and AI, and what is there, what is not in the side of this new Green Deal that we have, at least in the agenda of the Commission?
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I'm really happy to be on panel with so many inspiring and really knowledgeable people. Maybe I just wanted to zoom back a second, because I'm feeling maybe in this space not everyone knows about the environment in deep things. I would trust you lots on digital. But just to give back on policy level, what we base ourselves on, it's basically like scientific research that has been showing for the last decades that the human activity is responsible for, well, a lot of greenhouse gases emissions that have impact on our planet, mostly changing the temperatures, changing extreme water events, changing many ways we actually live, pollutions, etc. There's a concept called the Planetary Boundaries done by the Stockholm Resilience Center. It's basically scientists that identified 9 planetary boundaries that we should not cross if we want to remain in a safe space on Earth, among which climate change, but also biodiversity. We're currently living the 6th mass extinction of species. We have also like how the oceans are being acid and also losing life, how the soil are being treated, all the cycles that we have. Currently, we're going across 4 of those 9 boundaries. I think it's biodiversity, the ocean, climate change, obviously. And then last one I forgot. I think it's azote cycles. In terms of like the one we know most about in the media, it's mostly climate change. So you probably also heard about the Paris Agreement. This agreement was one of the responses that policymakers around the world came up with in order to address so GHG emissions and global change, like climate change. The point is to say we have to limit the global, change of temperatures to a certain level if we want to avoid really catastrophic events. Generally, scientists said back then it should be below 2 degrees, so we had a certain level. Globally, we should not go across 2 degrees increase because that would be terrible. Actually, and they said not above 2 degrees and towards 1.5 degrees. But for now, we had a report of the same scientists in 2018 actually checking out what would happen if we went we will actually go towards 1.5 increase. And already then, it was actually really problematic. And ever since then, we've also realized that the efforts we thought would be needed to go to that level were actually way beyond what we actually saw, which is why today we're hearing about all the things about Green New Deals, EU Green Deals, etc. For now, in the state of the art, all countries came up with some reduction of emissions. They have to come up with new levels in 2020, but if you take the efforts that are planned by the country themselves around the world, we would go towards an increase of 3 to 5. So it's way above what we are supposed to do, which is why it's actually critical to look at what technology can contribute in good and in bad in order to achieve, the levels we're supposed to achieve. For now, the report from November 2019 of the UN, the UNEP, so it's the UN Environmental Program, checked out how much effort we need to do. We need to decrease our emissions globally by 7.6% a year. And it has to start this year in 2020. So this year it's a really big year for about everything that is linked to climate change. So Joana explained very well that in terms of technologies, basically we have 2 problems: the material part, highly polluting, etc., and the energy part. For now, we have at least an increase of 9% each year of energy consumption attributed to ICTs. It's an amount of almost 9% of the global energy demand, could be 20%, 2030. So it really matters what we do now. It already accounts for 4% of global emissions today, and since we've seen it's really increasing, so that's really important to manage. So what could policy making actually achieve, and why are we talking about all those Green New Deals? Mostly we need to make everything we can to have, to be really clear about what is the environmental impact of digital technologies generally, but also to make sure that they're designed in a way that's sustainable. That means that has low energy consumption, that's inscribed in a circular economy, that's durable products as well as making sure that you don't produce things you don't need, because actually the most sustainable product is the one that you don't have, the one that doesn't exist. It doesn't have an impact. It's actually logical, but nice to say. So what policy making tools do we have? Basically, I'd say my first point would be to stress that we always have to think systematically. A big problem we have in, I think, every part of policy making is we always think in silos. We have people who are expert in something and they're trying to do something. So we have people who do stuff about digital, people who do stuff about the environment. It's actually two separate entities. For example, the European Commission, also in most ministries. But it's a bit like wanting to become a marathon champion by, doing 30 minutes there and 30 minutes there of running, but also like still having a lot of sugar, alcohol, and drugs on the other side. You can't really do both. You have to choose your battle. And it's the same in policy making. You can't say, hey, we will make something sustainable, but still continue to have lots of subsidies for polluting industries. And this is really what's happening right now. For example, in 2019 in France, we've had 11 billion euros in subsidies to fossil fuel industries. You can't have that and at the same time saying that you have to make the planet great again. That's just not possible. So you have also to be coherent in your approach. So basically what we can do as policymakers is incentivize private and public actors and also markets to go into a certain direction. That means setting standards through regulation directives. There are several things existing currently in the EU framework. For example, we have an EU action plan on circular economy that was proposed in 2015. We have an eco-design directive that's supposed to make products more sustainable, but more those who are energy linked. We have the EU eco-label to try to have pertinent information and to see what we have as products so people can really compare them and make sustainable choices. We have waste regulation, maybe on waste shipment. We have a directive on waste electrical and electronic equipment that's also really specific on electronics. We have the radio equipment directive that's supposed to regulate how things like most of our digital devices work and what the standards are. We also have directives about extraction of materials, but those are mostly applicable in the EU. So that's one way we have to try to influence things, setting standards so actors have to act accordingly. We also have stakeholders platforms where people can meet and exchange best practices. For now, we have, for example, the EU Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform, the EU Blockchain Observatory Forum, etc. And we also have ways of influencing through public procurement. Public procurement is everything that's linked to what you actually use as public administrations, as states, etc. And it currently accounts at 14% of the EU GDP, which means that if you already do something good there, you can really launch an incentive. So that's one thing. So basically, incentivize and regulating. A second way to influence is by monitoring impact and implementation. So for example, we can do environmental impact assessment, and that's something that's really not done systematically. Today, when we have a digital solution, we just say, oh, it's great, it's digital. Oh, no paper, so sustainable. But that's actually not true, as we have just seen. So having that more systematically to really accurately see what is the impact of what you're trying to put into place, and mostly having it before you're moving forward with the project, that's really important. Because if you say, hey, let's do 5G, it's great, and then realize in 20 years, oh, actually it was a terrible decision. Well, too bad we had 12 years to save the world, so it would be great to do it beforehand. Another way to monitoring is keeping track of the products along the value chain. So in that, basically, to having some platforms, etc., or to have the information being linked to products and being able to follow them is really important to see where our products going, are we really using them sustainably. Another thing would be it's linked to data. Public data is really important. It's you have to identify what kind of data you need and which one should be free of charge for every actor to have access to, because that way you can really make reliable research, enlighten policymakers, and well, make wise decisions and achieve the goals you actually want to achieve. You can also have observatories. Currently there is no observatory on the EU level telling you, hey, how can we make sure that all digital actions we take are also sustainable? So that would be also a way forward. Another good thing is to empower citizens. Citizens obviously are really important to take decisions, but you can't put all the blame on them saying, oh yeah, but they're not sustainable. Of course not sustainable if they don't have a choice, if you don't give them really the means to achieve what they would like to do. So it's giving clear information. It's also like preventing what we call greenwashing. Today we have lots of people saying, hey, this is so sustainable, and actually it's not really. It's just, well, they put green somewhere, but it's not actually green. So making sure that green claims are actually green is really a big battle that we have to win. Then it's also about giving access to redress mechanism. If a citizen says, oh, wow, I have this great tool, but actually it's just broken in 1 year and it should not be that way, how can they effectively make sure that, well, they get back something, or that they can, I don't know, find someone to address the problem, or hold the company accountable for saying, hey, this is like sustainable, supposed to be there for 5 years. So you have to find tools to really make the principles that you're trying to achieve also applicable in reality. So that's not just declarations, but also really enforceable. Obviously, research and development is really important, where you invest to be the research, it's really like something that has to be done. And then last but not least, it's mostly also about finance. Right now we were discussing this earlier, but we are also negotiating what we call the MFF. It's a multi-annual financial framework in the EU, and it's where the money is supposed to go for the 7 next years. And it's a bit the same thing with the marathon stuff, but if you say, hey, we're going to do a Green New Deal and be sustainable, but then all your money goes to gas infrastructures, which is not sustainable, it's not going to work. So that's why it's really important to also put the money in the good direction and not say just we're putting a bit more money here, but just really to redirect all the money towards what goal we actually want to achieve. I'll see that time is running up. So just on currently at say, I actually brought a text because I'm a legal nerd. So it's basically the Green New Deal communication of the Commission. I would say the good news is that they have identified that there is a dual need, both of the ecological transition and the digital one. So that's a first thing. They also said, yes, digital technologies are going to be key in order to achieve our goals, but it also can be a problem. We have to pay attention to the impact, etc. So I would say that that's rather a good sign. Then the question is always, will they deliver in that same way? They talk the talk, will they walk the walk? It's something we're going to see. We have several key moments. For example, in March, we will see another circular economy action plan, the AI plan at the same time, so we can see how both match. And I know that my colleagues are going to talk a bit more about concretely is what the Commission foresees really implementing what they want to foresee, and I think that's basically where we want to actually check what they're going to do. I think that's all I had to say, and I'll come back, and I'm looking forward to have all your information.
So thank you, Alexandra. I think following this path of the directives and recommendations and all this awareness that it's already there, it looks like this is already there, even in the document. I think there is still a lack of awareness in the main program of Horizon 2020, Horizon Europe, not right now. And I think you wanted to tackle this topic. Yeah.
I can't find the mouse. And then how do you... Yeah. Yes. Sorry. I'm an open source nerd, so I don't have any official Microsoft stuff, which is always interesting. So I'm Fieke, and like I think most people here, I actually don't come from the environmental corner, so I'm currently doing a PhD that looks into how data-driven policing is impacting society in Europe. And before that, I spent 10 years working as a practitioner on digital security, privacy, data protection, supporting people to sort of unpack technology and make informed choices. And since the last 3 years, I've been working with Joana, and she's been feeding me all this stuff about climate change. So while I was preparing for this panel, it's really great to go after these two great speakers. So while I was preparing for this panel, I was reading the AI white paper of the Commission for something else. And I'm actually going to use this as sort of maybe the umbrella of my talk, because what became very clear is that this AI white paper has a lot of blind spots. So let's just say, what are we talking about, and why is this white paper important? I think probably most people here have actually read it, but the white paper is important because it's going to set some of the strategy of the Commission around AI, and this also translates into funding sort of AI-related projects. So if you can see here, this is what happens when you have when you have LibreOffice going to Microsoft. It sort of changes. But according to the Commission itself, is that in 2016, Europe spent 3.2 billion in research and development on AI products. North America spent 12.1, and in Asia they spent 6.5 billion. So this is not a small market. We are investing huge amounts of money into sort of what is called artificial intelligence. And it's always framed as in, which we know from the privacy community, AI will save us, it will save us from terrorists, it will save the environment. But it's also framed in sort of a race to the bottom against sort of other geopolitical forces, because we have to compete with the Chinese, we have to compete with the US, and sort of this trustworthy AI from that the Commission is putting forward. If we don't invest in this and we don't become a sort of the third big force in AI, we're stuck using the things that are created in China. So this is how it's framed. So we need to invest more and more. And what you can also see in this is a commitment to more funds going into research and development of artificial intelligence. Then what is the scale we're talking about? So these are all numbers that are coming from the white paper. So they say that currently in their problem analysis, 80% of the current 40 zettabytes of data that exist is in non-European hands. This is because most is stored in cloud storage from Google to Amazon to things like this. So it's mostly not stored in European hands. So this is an issue. But they see that when in the near future, when more IoT products will be around, also when edge computing will be here, this will change sort of the data storage landscape, because this presumption is that in 2025, it will go from 40 zettabytes to 175 zettabytes that will be stored, data that will be stored, and it will be stored more locally on edge computing networks. So this is all from them. So the increase in IoT, increase in edge computing, and a massive increase in data. So this is what we're doing. And I see a lot of it has fallen off. But, and I think this is sort of kudos to the privacy data protection community and the anti-discrimination community. If you read the AI white paper of the Commission, they talk about things like what are challenging for governing AI. And the key challenges that are coming out of there is autonomy, opacity, self-learning. These are challenges for governance, and the concerns with these implementations, if we don't govern it properly, is liability, discrimination, and transparency. These are the things that the privacy and data protection community has fought hard for over years, that these are issues that come with data-driven systems. And I think, like, reading the Commission's white paper, this sort of comes out, and it's not just the data protection community, it's also the FATML, so the fairness, accountability, transparency, and machine learning community. But you see this coming back. And in my PhD, when I'm talking to policing, these are the words that keep on coming back. When we're implementing data-driven systems, we have to think about transparency, we have to take into account discrimination purposes. There's like liability. But what about the climate crisis? I found it quite surprising that while I was reading this white paper strategy on AI, of the supposedly green commission, the environment literally came back once, and only in relation to how it will save us, because every house will have a smart meter, and in this sense, consumers will be better off using energy. So not only is this problematic, because from also the privacy and digital rights community, we know that actually the only thing that really works is regulation. And like this entire responsibilization of the user will just end up in like the I agree buttons or things that don't really make a real impact. So if the only link between environment and impact of AI and sort of is that it will save us through smart meters, I think it's quite a problematic hypothesis. And then in sort of the Horizon 2020, I'm very sorry this fell off, but it was interesting, so I went to look, because then how is sort of the EU supporting this financially? It's through their funding mechanisms, which is currently Horizon 2020 and will be Horizon Europe in the future. And they have a new innovation clause out. So I was just looking for when does then environmental impact assessment come out? Because you would assume that like a data protection impact assessment or a human right impact assessment, an environmental impact assessment would also be necessary. And it had for the innovation a very specific clause which fell out, but if you want it, I can show you later on my computer, about please reflect on how you will minimize the environmental impact if possible. Not like how you will minimize it, but only if it's possible. So it's not even a hard criteria, because innovation apparently is more important, or we just assume that innovation will mitigate climate change. Whereas if you look, for instance, at the high-level expert group on AI, they made 7 recommendations about how requirements about what trustworthy AI would look like, and they even said this is a non-exhaustive list. These are 7 points that we found important, but there's probably more. And one of them was actually societal and well-being, point number 6, in which they said that sustainable and environmental friendly AI, we need to start thinking about this, not just assume that AI will do this, but how then does it tackle climate change and take into account that sort of the entire supply chain of AI also contributes to negative impacts on climate change. And what is interesting is that this point 6 apparently didn't make it from the high-level expert group on AI to sort of the white paper of the Commission, whereas other things about bias, discrimination, transparency, and liability did make it. So maybe a call to action is, because I think there's a lot of like overlap between the digital rights community and the environmental community. So I think the digital rights community has already made, it's used to be quite a insular sector, and I can say it because I was part of it, and I'm still part of it, but it's been able to sort of reach out and talk to anti-discrimination groups, to sort of other more traditional human rights groups. But I think, and they really put the issues around bias and discrimination on the agenda, but I do think it would be interesting to see if we can also bridge it to the environmental groups, because I think there could be a lot of overlaps between researching and developing ways that could be in which AI or any data-driven system could both be beneficial for our privacy and beneficial for the environment. Because, and I think there's not, currently this is a complete blind spot. So I would actually think we have to push back on the EU white paper, and especially on their blind spots against the environment. And why are we not funding research to see how can we do this more sustainable? What are actually practical ways of implementing, other than Microsoft putting sort of services into the ocean without knowing actually what the impacts are? So I think we need to support a lot of R&D on this. And so without it being in this white paper, I don't see this becoming a priority for something like Horizon Europe and the current Horizon 2020, which will be agenda setting for what will come in the next 5 years. So my call to action for sort of the digital rights community is to push back on this white paper on AI, because I'm sure none of the environmental groups have read it. And so we have to make a call for figuring out the blind spots. That was it.
Yeah, so thank you, Fieke, for illustrating these black spots in the AI paper and the future of the fundings for research in Europe. Yaser, let's go back to materials. So, and yeah, responsible sourcing is a top priority right now in the raw materials industry. And it's a complex issue, the topic of the cost efficiency and in the supplier chains. Please, could you bring us about some light on it?
Of course, yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here with us today. Thank you to all my panelists and for Joana and the Hangar team for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here because in my past I used to be a competition economist for data, so it's kind of like, it's nice to see to be back in the environment. And what I really want to talk about is perhaps to lift the hood a little bit on data and see underneath what happens with the supply chains that go into creating data and the devices that we need. So this presentation, to give you in a nutshell what I'm aiming to do, looks at how the increased demand for data affects supply chains. So I want to introduce to you a little bit on the complexity of supply chains. I want to explore how they work, and then I want to discuss some solutions to common issues that emerge. And as I hope you'll start to see as I go through, how we look at data really changes these supply chains. To tell you a little bit more about myself, so I work for an organization called Minesipder. We are a Berlin-based protocol for responsible sourcing on the blockchain. So that's a lot, but what it essentially means is that we take minerals and then we reflect minerals on blockchain via a certificate. This certificate has information on the mineral, such as how responsibly sourced it is, and it can also take different certifications. This certificate can then be transferred up the supply chain, giving more people in the supply chain information and potentially also the consumers. I'm more than happy to talk more in depth about this if you find me a little bit later on during the coffee sessions or during lunch. It's also available on our website. We do a lot of projects to try and do pilots this protocol. Currently, we're doing one of the biggest tin traceability projects, and we have found is extremely responsible and ethically sourced tin mine, and then we're going up their supply chain to see where that happens and how we can encourage for it to be used responsibly. We're also helping Volkswagen to look through their entire lead supply chain to understand how responsible it is and to also understand how it can be incentivized to happen more so. So, some basic assumptions of this talk is that the demand for data is increasing exponentially. Now, it is my personal opinion that this is not going to change, but what this means is that there will be an increased demand on rare earth minerals and that these supply chains are going to become very stressed. In parallel, we see, for example, that a lot of batteries and an energy transition towards batteries becoming more prevalent, and this also leads to the already in-place supply chains becoming more stressed because they use rare earth minerals. In other words, as we demand more, there's lots of potential for things to become more stressed. So, but then let's take a step back. And before I go on, I want to talk about what we actually want here. All of us in an ideal world, we want carbon neutral, responsibly produced and delivered devices that ethically handle data. Like in a perfect scenario. But this is kind of difficult to get to. And what I want to talk about is the supply chain perspective of how to get there. So, I assume everyone here has a smartphone. And to give you an idea of how complex these things become, so on average, a smartphone has inside of it 62 minerals. If we assume that each mineral takes 6 steps to your phone, and even if we're doing in a recycled loop, it can also take 6 steps, then we have 372 steps just for manufacturing of the smartphone, a device that creates data. And then where this data goes onto the server farms, the server farms have their own manufacturing processes and what happens to them and so forth. Where, for example, the box that your phone comes in has its own manufacturing and supply chain processes. But just as a human being to exist right now in the modern world, there's hundreds, if not tens of thousands of supply chains that help us do what we want to do. I think that's quite fascinating, but we also have to explore all of them and the things and to see that one change in one end could directly impact others. So the question is, how do these steps emerge? Well, generally, they seem to happen quite organically. They're through, they're through a miracle of modern economics. The organizations, what you will also find is that they really struggle to to know who supplies their suppliers. They know their first-tier suppliers, but when you go to the second or third-tier suppliers, it's really dark. They don't know, so these chains are not linked to each other. That's, for example, where we come in, where we help create these establishments. Now, it's difficult then to understand what level of transparency is needed. So when you ask something from your first supplier, what can you ask from your second supplier, and who wants to send what where? So if I say that I'm complicit to a legislation, it could be GDPR, it could be any other legislation, what information am I actually sending to others that could give away business secrets? Finding this balance is very difficult. In other words, organizations very much do care about their own privacy. But then what is the main driver here? Is that supply chains grow to be as cost efficient as possible. That's where, it's like a living organism looking for the most cost efficient place to produce something, to get you that data and to get you that phone. So nobody that we have talked to is unaware of the limits of supply chains. We all know the potential hazards that are there, either that are through the environment, through a loss of data, or through, for example, human rights abuse. Effective legislation exists in very small segments. For example, the handling of lead in Germany there's fantastic legislation there, but there isn't so much that is interconnected to each other. There is incoming EU legislation that's a very good start, but it's limited its scope because, for example, it addresses only conflict minerals. And so there isn't really a whole encompassing solution that can help transfer information. What is very true about them, though, is that the power really lies with the customer. So it's much easier for the customer to tell the supplier to change direction or course than the other way around. So if we're looking, for example, to implement a solution, then where does this really come from? It comes from top down. So we've established, how complex supply chains are. I've also talked a little bit about the different attempts for legislation to come in and work through. But what I really want to share with you also is some possible lessons from our pilots and some solutions for how we can change supply chains to become more responsible, either for the creation of data or also for the creation of manufacturing processes. So the most important thing is we need to make being good easier. We need to help organizations and also help consumers. And when I say organizations, we're sometimes tempted to think of, say, the big five in tech. But when you think of the process that goes into, say, recycling a battery, there's thousands of organizations that do this, including many small ones. For example, a garage that is family-owned that does recycling to a very effective degree. What we want to help is to amplify the accomplishments of the people who do things well, to give them so they can send this information up the supply chain. So if we work with a really responsible tin and we put on the market a product that has only responsible minerals, then others will soon have to also consider what they're doing there. We also want to help consumers. So if you as a consumer know exactly where the minerals come from that are in your products, you can then ask questions of your organizations, but you also have an understanding for the complexity that is behind it. We don't want everything to be opaque. So we build on strengths. If there is effective legislation, the ones that are there, we link them together. We continuously refine them and we share best practices. So organizations, we help them come together to understand what minimum amount of information is needed to be transferred. So if everyone is handling lead correctly, why are we all afraid to tell each other this? It doesn't make sense. And then if we all want to look at different types of legislation for how we want to help data and how this affects organizations around the world, then we want to provide an open platform to share best practices. So, and then start with low-hanging fruits. There are very short supply chains. There are very simple products that we can use to create, for example, highly responsible use of data or highly responsible use phone. We need people to become more aware of these, and we need to make it okay to be transparent about how things are produced. And this third step is, unfortunately, we do need to be patient a little bit. Changes won't happen overnight, but the momentum that is building, we need to ride. So we need to standardize how we report how things are being made, but this requires consultation with everybody. We cannot just talk about change that happens on a European level and then imagine that this has no impact on different parts of the world. Inclusivity means that incentives need to be identified. What helps organizations up the supply chain is different to what helps them downstream, and they come in very many different sizes. So if we go back, we want to be carbon neutral, responsibly produced and delivered devices that ethically handle data. We really have no choice but to work together. Thank you. And I'm open to any questions.
So thank you very much, Yaser. I would like to open the floor for the audience. So I guess there's a couple of questions. We have seen a very strong, 4 strong contributions. So maybe you have already some questions there. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. So let's go first.
Hello, I'm Jan Tobias. I'm a computer science researcher at the University of Leuven, and I'd like to raise a point on the ethics discussion that should take place here, and on the way how we consider ethics, what we consider as ethical, and how we reason about ethics in general. So the exciting thing that I observe a lot is when I write research proposals is that if I do that, let's say, together with a biologist, and I want to torture a mouse in the course of the research I'm planning, I have to write a huge ethics assessment, explain what I'm going to do with that mouse, if I could do it any better, any more animal friendly, if I could do with a few less mice, what I'm going to do with those mice once I'm done torturing them, stuff like that. So it's a huge process. If I do a purely technical proposal, it's all about money. I can buy as many cars as I need to involve in that proposal. I can buy as much big as equipment I need to implement whatever I want to do, whether it's AI or, in my case, security. And I don't even have to mention that these components, this equipment I buy will actually probably cause a couple of deaths in Africa, in India, will probably result in people being deprived of a future as we have it. And that's not even part of the discussion we're having right now. So I think that comes back to the mentioning of blind spots in regulation that we had before, that our way of thinking about ethics is, from my understanding, completely screwed towards people in Europe and maybe even animals in Europe, and they come even before people in the global south. Thank you.
Fieke, you want to answer?
Do we first want to take
Okay.
a few?
Yeah, okay. Let's take a few questions. So
Oh, yeah, thanks for the comment.
yours?
There's
Another question here?
Oh. There's one here, and there's two
one
here.
2 here, yeah.
So thank you for your presentation. My name is Laura Kiviharju. I'm a data protection lawyer. And I was wondering what thoughts do you have how data protection legislation could support these environmental topics and sustainability. The idea where I got this is that in Giovanni Buttarelli's last report, he raised a few critical topics for data protection, and one of them was interplay with the data protection and environment. So he, for example, mentioned that data minimization with the idea that you collect less data could also support sustainability. So I would be really happy to hear your thoughts on that topic, how these two areas could support each other. Thank you.
Okay. Another question here? Sure.
So, I want to take a question.
Let's do
Maybe let's-
the
let's
first
take the
round of
questions,
questions and then we pick it up.
Hi, I'm Shankar Narayan with Create Our Future in Seattle. I'm interested in kind of the intersection of the climate issue with big tech accountability, which is an area I work a lot in. I'm thinking about your remarks and thinking about a presentation I made this year of a shareholder proposal to Amazon's board on facial recognition, right? At that same meeting, there were climate change activists from the company also presenting resolutions on climate change and reducing Amazon's carbon footprint. And it seemed to me actually that their proposals were received much better, right? Like we didn't get to actually ask any questions, right? The mics didn't come anywhere near us, but they went to the climate change activists, and it looked as if they had a pre-prepared response. It looked as if they were concerned about really wanting to look at least like they cared about climate change and wanted to reduce their footprint. So I'm wondering, right, what's your experience been for any of you that have experience there? Is it real, or is it really just a PR sort of move on the part of a company like Amazon?
Is there another question? Okay, then let's.
We could start with this.
Yeah, there's another one there. And the last one.
Hi, I'm Olivier Njus. I work as a compliance and data protection officer at Swift. And I want to maybe more share an experience that I had with you. It's related to the intersection between GDPR and climate change. We've been working on a data retention policy lately. And because we are going to put a lot, and we already put some burden on the business, we thought of all the reasons why the business would like to be on board and to do this exercise. And the fact that not storing so much data would help reduce the carbon footprint was really something that that talked to the people. So that's one positive thing. And in relation to that, I would like to know if you would have numbers, maybe figures, about how much someone, just an employee, could reduce his carbon footprint deleting data.
So thank you for the question. So maybe let's start for the first one, and the ethics, the diverse criteria that we are applying on ethics when dealing with these topics. Who wants to tackle this topic?
I mean, I can say something about it. I totally agree. Like, I think, I mean, there are some ethics now. We have 5 minutes left. So I agree. I think we have to be, it has to apply to many different things. And I think this is why it's really important to address these blind spots in sort of the new areas of interest, because I think these things have to become far more prominent. So, and then maybe on the big tech accountability, I'll leave the other ones. I think you have to approach Google like you approach Shell. Shell also does green stuff. But in the end, the business model doesn't change. And the key business model of these big five is data analysis and selling it for commercial purposes. So I wonder what the environmental suggestions were that they made. They probably weren't cutting down the interface, for instance, of Amazon.com. It was probably more likely into natural cooling of their servers, maybe putting it somewhere else. So yeah. I would be very skeptical about the proposal, but maybe it was very interesting. But I doubt it had anything to do with the core business model of Amazon. And then there is there's a word in German that's called Datasparsamkeit. I think here there's a clear overlap between data protection and environmental impact.
Hey, so for me, like, going around the first comment, I totally agree. I think there should be like, also you should be obliged to, I have ethical concerns about all the machinery that you're going to use and how you're going to use it. Like personally in my projects, I try to put how much CO2 is going to emit just by going and visit them on the website, which is not enough at all. I try hard to quantify, but yeah, great point. I mean, it's really important. For the second, for Amazon, this is my opinion. I'm very, very critical. Like Amazon, Google, everybody. Because also, like, there was this report from Greenpeace, like I think it was last year, which I stated that Amazon was by far the most polluting company and the ones that made the least effort in running on renewable energies. But again, what does it mean to run on renewable energies? And I think that's also a question, because Microsoft understands like putting servers under the sea, right? And also, like, a company just doesn't run in the infrastructures of their own company. Yeah? I mean, we are producing the data with our devices, and there is a lot of middlemen before you get to actually the company. So what if those devices are not running renewable energies, right? So it's a very, very complex issue that you cannot just solve and say, yeah, we are green, we are renewable. It doesn't work like that. And regarding GDPR and I mean, both cases, it's a great point. Yesterday, I was talking to some people who were talking about this. I think it could help. I don't think the only thing is just to reduce the amount of data we collect, because I think it's hard at this point to limit the amount of data we collect. I don't see how this could be happening. It's very controversial, but I think that what's more problematic is that we lack the imagination of thinking about other solutions. And that's the biggest problem. Even myself and all we are here, we've been working in this issue for a long time, and yeah, we might have some tips, right? But there is, until a point, because there is things that I cannot imagine yet. And I think that's the real problem, because it's very hard to change behavior. And I think a big matter of it is change behavior. And well,
lots has been said already. I'd say on GDPR questions, we should take anything we can anywhere. My problem is maybe just in terms of in implementation and actual application of the regulation. I guess, yeah, if it's really well implemented, it could help, but we should not maybe keep thinking that small steps here and there are going to help. It's a really systematic issue that we need to address as such. It's also like a huge cultural change. Basically, what we need to achieve in order to go where we need to go, we need to change our entire industrial system from linear to circular. We need to stop thinking that consumption is buying new products all the time and thinking how we can repair them, make them more durable, how we can be cool without having this brand new stuff in everything. We need to question the very concept of growth and how it actually impacts our societies, how we can think that producing more will not extract more resources and thus, well, bring us to environmental chaos. And we also need to think that it's great to be global, but is global exploiting people at the other end of the world, like you mentioned on ethics, in order to have like cheap shoes or cheap electronics, since we hear about electronics, maybe thinking what can be great on a global level, but what we can also try to produce more locally and how we can be happy with that as well. So I'd say, like you're saying, did they mean it? I mean, I guess usually when you ask someone, well, would you like to have a good environment? They want that, no, I love pollution. That's not really what they say. I'd say there is awareness and what we say and then what we can do about it. And I think right now we really need to address things more. And it's linked with other issues like inequalities and repetition of wealth. Oxfam just made a report explaining how wealth is currently being distributed around the world. And we need also to think, well, what's money about and where should we put it? And is it normal that a few people have everything and the rest of the world is like, sorry, we can't make any change because we don't have the money. So that would be my conclusion.
I can just comment perhaps on the last question about tech and accountability, big tech organizations and accountability. So, of course, I don't know the context of the situation that you described, but I can explain in the same wavelength my own personal experiences. And that it doesn't really make sense for these organizations not to be aware of these problems or not to be aware of, say, issues in responsible sourcing or that come in the supply chain. I think, on the other hand, they are extremely well aware. What we need to keep in mind is that these organizations are very big. So the sustainability department could be an entire different company to the sales team, or that could be also a completely different company to other parts of it. So they are living organisms, as I would say, but they're also at the same time very, very, it doesn't make sense for an organization to not know where its supply chains come from because they're very afraid that something could go wrong in these supply chains, and this economically does not make sense. Unfortunately, is this, politically perhaps our most ideal situation? I don't know. I'm not here. I can't say to that. But the reality is, at some point, these situations will affect the economics of organizations, and they are aware of this, and they are taking steps to try and change it. Is this fast enough? That's not for me to decide, but that's for other organizations.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we run out of time, so it's a pity because it's a long discussion and it could be a long debate. And so I thank all the panelists. Thank you for being here. And I really do hope and only wish that next year in the CPDP conference and in the Parliament and in the Commission and in the companies and in the civil society, so there will be more and more awareness, not only about the material impact of the technology, but as well of this data extractivism, that it's another impact that we haven't talked about. Okay, so thank you very much for being here, and let's